else out. And there we go. Hi, everyone. This is Margaret Hershey at Home with Hershey's, and thank you for joining us for our wellness talk today. You know, your health is your true wealth. There's no doubt about it. It's no good being the richest person in the graveyard. That's going to be no good to you. So that's why we're working with you, your bodily health and your mental health. And we were just saying that the two are so interconnected. Your body controls your body has to be healthy, but your mind controls your body. So your body doesn't control the mind. Now, you might say, Margaret, that's the biggest load of rubbish. Well, let me just give you a for instance. I want you to all close your eyes, and that means you too, Glenda. And I want you to think about yourself going in and biting into a lovely, juicy lemon. Mwah. Now, you can open your eyes and just think, is your mouth full of spit? Of course it is, full of spit. Because your mouth was ready to bite into that juicy lemon. Is there a juicy lemon? No, but your mind told your body there was, and your body prepared for it. And so prepares for everything else in life. And that's why it's so important that your mind is healthy and it controls your body, and you make sure that everything is good. But before we go on, I just want to wish Jess a very happy birthday for today. We're saying happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jess. Happy birthday to you. Hooray! Another Sagittarius.
Thanks,
Special people. So, but now we've got a very special guest chat today. We've got Julie, and she's going to be talking to us about the gut. And the gut, as you know, is so important. There's nothing. Have you ever been constipated in your life? I haven't been since I've been vegan, I must tell you, but I used to be. My mother spent her whole life, she's 97 years old now, her whole life being constipated. She still takes her opening medicine every day. Isn't that just ridiculous? And I said, Mom, if you changed your diet, you wouldn't have to do this. No, I just like my food. And that. So I think it's just so important to have your gut 100%. So come in, Julie, you are an expert on the gut and how it makes you feel. Tell us about it.
Well, first of all, Margaret, thank you so much. This is so great. It's obviously talking about health is my favorite subject. So just to give your listeners just a brief overview of who I am and what my qualification is, I'm a functional medicine practitioner. So really, as a functional medicine practitioner, what I do is that I address issues like genetics, your lifestyle, what you eat that you shouldn't eat, what you don't eat that you should eat, your stress and how that impacts on what we call non-communicable diseases. So those are the diseases like heart attack or stroke or Alzheimer's or diabetes. And so basically I look at the body as a whole, and then all those little factors that feed into health as a whole, I address those. So mostly with me, it's not a matter of, I've got this particular problem. As you just mentioned, your mom's opening medicine, I love that, so because we don't want to just do that. We want to look at what's causing the problem, as a whole, and address the body as a whole. And I think, so what I'm going to do with the gut, I'm going to look at the picture from an overview. So not specifically on the gut, but how does the health of our physical health and our mental health, how does that relate to the health of our gut? And is there a sort of a bi-directional feedback with what's happening with the gut and how that relates to our mental health or our physical health? So there's definitely a bi-direction in terms of gut and stress and mental health. So I think, to put it into perspective, people sometimes rely on the fact that medical science is progressing so beautifully. But what they're not looking at is that really our vital health is declining. So we may live longer, but the quality of our life is diminishing. Nowadays, when we look at children, we've got children now who are obese. Type 2 diabetes used to be what we call mature onset diabetes, and now children of 8 years old are getting type 2 diabetes. So diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, stroke, all of these diseases are on the rise. I think all of us listening, we can all probably cite members of our family, even ourselves. We might be diabetic, or we might have had a stroke, or we might, people that we know have had a heart attack. And people are getting worried because they are not sure how they address this. So what do? They go in and they have a little chat with Dr. Google, and Dr. Google is very, very frightening. So you look at that and you think, yeah, I'm dying, I'm on my way out. And the other problem is there's a lot of conflicting information. So you look at Dr. Google and you look at one study and it says one thing, and you look at another study and it says something completely opposite. And now we don't know what to believe. And for all of us, health is not your industry. You have a different industry. Health is my industry. but we don't have the time to research, or most people don't have the time to research. And the other big problem is that medical costs are exorbitant. So even if you're on a medical aid, you're looking at some of the medical aids, if their family's on a medical aid, you know, they're paying 8,000 Rand or 10,000 Rand towards the medical aid in a month. You know, so it really, really is very, very expensive. So what I did was I had a quick look before this lecture on Dr. Google at the hits. So even though we're going to be talking about the gut, if we look at just insulin resistance or diabetes, because it does impact, there are about 74,000 hits a month on Dr. Google just on that topic. Obesity, 200,000 hits a month. Cancer, 800,000 hits a month. Depression, because the gut and depression are quite closely associated, 1.2 million hits on depression a month going through Google. And diabetes, it's 1.5 million. So people are looking, they're searching for answers, and it's not always so easy to find them. The other thing is, well, when you're looking at poor health, I touched on cost, you know, how expensive medical costs are. But if we just take out the costs associated with our medical aids and you look at time away from work, so if you look at your work productivity and how poor health affects work productivity, so you've got time away from work, whether or not you are in hospital or whether or not you're just going to see your doctor, poor performance at work. So brain acuity, so how sharp your brain is a big impactor on what your performance at work is going to be like, what your mood is like, just how you feel about yourself, you know, and how you, whether you've got a joie de vivre and whether you're going into work and you're thinking, yay, you know, I love my job, and you portray that to the customers. Never mind your own family, you know, low mood and the blues and all that is going to affect whether or not, you know, you feel vibrant. Depression, brain fog, I've already addressed those, low energy. The other thing, of course, which is very dear to all of our hearts at the moment, is this infectious spread, because there is no doubt that if we are dealing, as we are now, with a pandemic, with an infectious spread, if you have fundamental good health, then you have less to fear. And if you have less to fear, then your mood is better. We're not living, you know, in a world where we're terrified to go out. We certainly, when you're looking at, you know, a company like Hershey's, where you're dealing with customers all the time, you don't want to deal with the customers and be afraid. Motivation is affected. And of course, the issue a big issue is the financial issue. So when you look at poor health, there are obviously many reasons for poor health, and some of them are very overt. So, for example, the overt ones would be accidents, you know, cancer, heart disease. These are overt reasons for poor health. But the ones that come in under the radar are the more covert ones. So aging, we all age, but just because we age does not mean to say that we have to age faster. And aging does not need to affect us. I mean, we all know people who may be in their 90s who are really, really vibrant. And we want to be like those people. We don't want to be in our 40s and barely able to get out of bed. Stress is a big impactor for general health. And I'm going to focus on stress more with this talk, stress in the gut, hormone imbalance, obesity. And next week, we're going to address sort of insulin, obesity, pre-diabetes, diabetes. We're going to look at and how sugar impacts our body next week. Brain fog, poor concentration, there's a gut association with that, and there's a sugar association with that. So as I say, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to cover that, and our mood and depression. So really, I've tried to distill this down into the biggies. So the biggies are aging, stress, our gut and inflammation, and then sugar, insulin resistance, and diabetes. So we're going to look at stress in the gut this week, sugar, insulin resistance, and diabetes next week. But because, you know, I don't know how many women there are listening versus men. Men seem to cope so much better with their aging. You know, women, we want to look young. We want to look like we're 20, even though we might be in our 60s. So I just want to briefly touch on aging. And I think the thing to understand is that aging doesn't need to lead to diminished function. Just because we're older doesn't mean that we necessarily have to have the general aging processes impacting on our body. So when we're looking at aging, we want to address issues like optimal levels of hormones and neurotransmitters, because it affects our mood and how good we feel about ourselves, and, you know, how motivated we are. obviously, when we're looking at aging, we want to balance the risks versus the benefits. Cortisol and stress affects how fast we age. And cortisol and stress affects the health of our gut as well. So it's not just what we eat that affects our gut. We can have an excellent diet. So, Margaret, I know that you're a vegan. So you could have an excellent diet with lots of vegetables and fruits and still have a problem with your health because your stress is impacting so negatively. Our hormones, I mentioned, so our estrogen, our progesterone, our testosterone levels all affect how fast we age, and what affects our brain function and our motivation. Because you know what, we're going to be older if we're not motivated. The second biggie is the stress response. So when you're looking at the stress response, we're looking at what we call the Hpa Axis. So that's the HPA stands for Hypothalamus, Pituitary, and Adrenal Axis. And what happens when we're stressed, basically, is that when we're in a stress situation, our body releases adrenaline and cortisol, and these are our stress hormones. Now, normally what happens is that, let's say, for example, we are living in the bygone years and we are presented with a saber-toothed tiger. Our body's appropriate response to the saber-toothed tiger is going to be a normal release of adrenaline and cortisol. Every time adrenaline is released, our body releases cortisol as well. Because your focus on that is either freeze and pretend you're a tree or run away as fast as you possibly can. And this is a survival response. But what happens in this day and age, and I actually think with this whole pandemic that we're all dealing with a degree of post-traumatic stress disorder because we feel under attack. So whether we're dealing with, all the changes that are associated with something like the pandemic, or whether we're dealing with our relationship, for example, with our boss, or whether we're dealing with perhaps an unhappy marriage, or perhaps parents who are very ill, or children who are very ill, what happens in our body, we get a chronic stress response. So instead of the immediate or the acute fight or flight response, we get a chronic fight or flight. And what the body does in a stress response, because the body needs to deal with either turning and fighting with what you have to face or running away, the body needs to prep for that. So as soon as we're under stress, how the body does this is it releases the stored sugar that we have in the muscles, because you need that sugar, you need that energy so that you can actually either turn and fight or you're going to run away. The other thing that it does is that it redirects the blood from our non-essential bodily functions to our essential bodily functions. So for example, it constricts, when we're stressed, it constricts the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So obviously that's this part of the brain. And that's because when you're in a stress situation, you don't need to think. All you need to do is either run away or fight. There's no thinking and deciding and analyzing that goes on. So in a work situation, when you are dealing with chronic stress, in other words, stress that is an everyday issue, you're not going to be able to think because you have this chronic constriction of the blood in the prefrontal cortex. The other thing is that when you're in a chronic stress situation, all our digestive functions are now inefficient. So our body views digestion as being non-essential when you're in a stressed response. And that's where part of our gut issues come into play when you're stressed. So you don't digest well. So Margaret, we were chatting before and you mentioned the bloating story. When people are stressed, very often they tend to bloat because their body is just not digesting properly. There are other issues for bloating, of course, which we may go into it a little bit later. But so with both acute and with chronic stress, we get a shutdown of these non-essential organs. Now, the question arises is why necessarily is stress a bad thing, and what's wrong with adrenaline and cortisol? And the biggest issue is that when cortisol and adrenaline are constantly flooding our system, we have issues with our sugar management, so we can't lose weight. So people, for example, who are having problems with increased obesity, those are sugar management issues, and it's not always about what we eat. So sometimes, for example, especially if you're very stressed and your body's not losing weight, you can go on a diet where you're eating lettuce leaves, and very, very healthy food. And you're thinking, well, you know what, I'm not losing an ounce. So if you don't address your stress management right up front, there's no knock-on effect with what's happening in the rest of the body. The other thing with cortisol and adrenaline and the sugar management is sugar impacts our risks of Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is becoming more and more prevalent. And there's no situation where you can just take a pill. There is no effective, I'm going to call it a monotherapy for treating Alzheimer's. So first thing, address stress, cortisol, adrenaline. It affects our thyroid, so it affects our thyroid hormones, and that of course affects our concentration, and it affects how fast we're going to lose weight. It affects our body temperature, so we cool all the time. It affects our gut health, so we get that sense of bloating, discomfort, reflux, so heartburn and generalized inflammation is associated with that. It affects our brain function, again, because it constricts the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So all our higher, what we call our higher order cognitive functions are basically ineffective. They're not working properly. And it affects our neurotransmitters. So if, for example, our neurotransmitters are affected, this increases our propensity to feel depressed. And I think for a lot of people, we've all heard of serotonin. So if, for example, you do struggle with depression, you've heard of Prozac. So these are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, so SSRIs. And what they do is that they allow serotonin to remain in the brain for longer. But that in itself is going to be affected by our gut, because 80% of our serotonin is actually made in our gut. So if we have gut dysfunction and our body is not making enough serotonin, it doesn't matter if you're on an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, because the body's not producing enough serotonin in the first place. So it can't hold the serotonin because there isn't enough to hold. So good gut function is, and depression and how much serotonin we're producing are very closely tied. The other thing is that high levels of cortisol, so they shrink the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a tiny little part of our brain that's the seat of our memory. So when our hippocampus is getting smaller, we don't remember as well. And of course, that feeds into the whole Alzheimer's, it's that downward slide. And again, of course, it affects our pro-inflammatory cytokines. So adrenaline promotes inflammation. And when we promote inflammation, it affects inflammation in the brain. And of course, that results in brain fog. So when you're looking at what increases stress, again, you're looking at this bidirectional feedback. So the causes of increased stress would be mental and emotional stress, everything, something we've all been dealing with that for the past 2 years. Our sugar dysregulation, which we're going to go into in more detail next week, that definitely increases our stress. So when we have a very high sugar diet, and by sugar, often I'll say to people, how much sugar do you eat? And they say, I hardly eat any sugar at all. I don't ever put sugar in my tea. But if you have bread every day, or if you have potato, or if you have rice, effectively the body cannot tell the difference between rice and potato and a spoonful of sugar. The impact on the body is the same, because the conversion of those very processed carbohydrates is immediately converted into glucose in the body. So the body sees it in the same way that it sees sugar. So you get the circular problem. Gut dysfunction is another cause of increased stress in the body. Food sensitivities, I'm not sure how much we're going to talk about that now, but it does impact a lot. But gluten, for example, gluten and dairy cause a lot of inflammation in the body. They cause a lot of gut problems. In fact, I'm definitely going to address this now that I'm going through this. Infections, so infections in the gut, but also systemic infections, they increase our body stress. So our stress is not just how we relate to our world. Our stress is also what the body has to deal with. And of course, our hormone imbalances too, and that includes our thyroid. So when we're looking at stress, sleep disorders. Now, with Connectable Life, we've done a whole little webinar on sleep disorders. And if you cannot sleep well, then you're going to be stressed, you're going to have gut dysfunction, and your body's not going to digest things properly. And the problem is, I know, you know, for people, women especially, we cross the 50 mark, we hit menopause, and all of a sudden sleep just goes out the window. But for young women too, when you've got young children, you're not sleeping. And sleep is very, very important for reducing our stress. Cortisol makes you fat, and fat increases your body's inflammation, and inflammation breaks down your gut's ability to digest food. So inflammation increases your inflammatory cytokines. So something like interleukin 6, for example, is an inflammatory cytokine, because fat and inflammation are so closely linked. When you're fat, you're inflamed, and when you're inflamed, you're more likely to get fat. So if you're trying to lose weight, if you don't address your stress, you don't address your gut function, you can't address your inflammation, and you will not lose weight. Mood disorders, so the depression and anxiety, and poor nutrient status, because, and this is why eating a diet that is high in nutrients is really important, because even though you may have a diet that has enough calories, if you don't eat your vitamins as well, your body cannot process the food that you're eating. So the cellular function goes down. And if the cellular function goes down, again, you're back to a high inflamed state, because your body cannot bring down the systemic inflammation. With a high inflamed state, your body cannot deal with any infections that you're exposed to. And you get this vicious, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. And sometimes, I see clients and I almost look at them and think, I don't know where to start with you, because there are a lot of factors that feed into their poor health. And unfortunately, for some of us, and I have to say the men are the worst here. For some of us, because there's so much that needs to be changed, we just think, well, you know what, is it even worth it? But it really, really is, because there's always a starting point. There's always a place where you can say, all right, from now, if I do this, and this change, it's taken me 10 years to get to where I am now. If it takes me a year to change that cycle, that's okay. It doesn't matter how long it takes, because that process, again, in the same way, it might be a negative snowball going down a hill. It could be a positive snowball as well. So if you're going to reduce stress, aside from addressing gut function, which we're going to talk about now, but the first one is going to be change your diet so that your body gets enough nutrients so that it can use those nutrients to affect how motivated you feel, your energy levels, because if you have energy, you're more likely to exercise, you're more likely to be motivated, you're more likely to be moving, you have more energy to just live your life. Stress, almost a number one is improving your sleep, so practicing good sleep hygiene, movement and exercise. And exercise, I think, again, so I have a distinction between exercise for people who are let's say triathletes, and what I call restoring exercise. I'm not big on these hectic exercise regimes. First of all, because for normal people like all of us, we tend to not do them, but also because these hectic exercise regimes, they produce their own stress in the body. So sometimes you can get almost a negative spiral. So I like to, what I call restoring exercise, which might be just going for a walk around the block. You get back from work and you put the lead on the dog and you just go for a little walk around the block. And slowly you increase your pace on that same walk until you, instead of walking longer, you're walking less time, but you're walking faster. Reducing stress with deep breathing and mindfulness. So whether or not it's a meditation and stress reducing techniques are not a luxury. They're actually a necessity, because stress impacts on, it's like a domino, it impacts on so many physical functions. Daylight exposure. Now we live in this beautiful country. We have so much sunlight, but the problem is we get up in the morning, we go to work, we're inside. So when you hit your lunchtime, go outside, go and sit in the sun and expose your body to the South African sunlight. It's incredibly healthy for mood and, of course, for the vitamin D exposure. Just something while I'm talking about vitamin D, the darker your skin, the harder it is for your body to process vitamin D. So on very pale skins, they can go out in the sunlight for less time than a darker skin, and they will process the vitamin D, the very necessary vitamin D, much faster. So vitamin D is one of those blood tests that if you can, it's worth getting tested, because your vitamin D levels need to be higher in your body if you want to combat issues of getting infected. There've been countless studies that address vitamin D and your risk of catching COVID, for example. So increasing vitamin D is very, very important. I do not understand why the governments, they don't subsidize vitamin D. So instead of loading lots of money PCR testings, they could use that money and they could subsidize vitamin D, because from a health perspective, the impact would be huge. To take downtime, so as I said, it's not a luxury. If you can afford a massage or you've got a very, very willing partner, it's fantastic. Take some downtime and have those. And then some supportive supplements, but of course that depends on the patient. I'm not pro just going on multivitamins or even probiotics. I'll talk about those now, because everybody has their own particular issue and our bodies are unique. So to create a situation with a unique body, you need to look at where you stand with your diet. You need to look at where you stand with your gut function. In other words, if you're going to go onto a supplement, can your body even digest that supplement? So you might need to adjust digestion first. Otherwise, you're just pouring money down the drain. So let's go into gut in a little bit more detail. So what happens with the gut? Yes.
Sorry,
Yes,
can
questions?
I jump in before we move on to the gut? There's just been a few questions that I think we can cover before we move on, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
The first question was, is high blood pressure a response to stress?
Yes. But it's also a response to weight. So for example, generally what happens is if your blood pressure starts to climb, now blood pressure naturally starts to climb as you get older because the vessel walls stiffen as you get older, and that's also a dietary issue. So it's a sugar issue in actual fact. The vessel walls stiffen and then they don't expand nicely. So blood pressure is associated with aging. Blood pressure is associated with stress, and you know, I'm having a menopausal moment. I can't remember what my third issue was, but oh yes, and gut and blood pressure is associated with weight. So if you've got high blood pressure, the first thing that you can do is if you bring down your weight, if you're carrying extra weight by even as much as 10%, you will bring your blood pressure down, and you might even find it takes you from being into a higher risk into sort of a very manageable risk. Hope that answers that question.
And then the second question was, are supplements necessary even if you're eating a good diet?
Also a great question. Okay, so a good diet, sometimes, so it's quite a loaded question, that, because sometimes you can eat a good diet, but we tend to eat the same foods, and we actually need diversity because so many different foods have so many different vitamins. And in actual fact, there's a process called hormesis where the body works best when there's lots of variability, and the body uses the variety in different vitamins to support other vitamins. So variety is key, not necessarily just eating a good diet. You want a good diet, but a great variety. And then the other problem is unfortunately, because most of the food that we get is not organic, so it's vitamin depleted. So sometimes you can be eating what is perceived as being a very good diet, but the amount of vitamins that are coming in, if you have a particular problem. So for example, let me use magnesium as an example. Magnesium is essential for probably, I would say, close on 1,000 metabolic functions. And yet, even on a good diet, magnesium is notoriously deficient in a Western diet. So if you have problems that may be associated with deficiency of magnesium, a good diet is not enough to get you just over that tipping point where your body can then start having saturation levels with magnesium, for example, so that you get that trickle down effect into the rest of the sort of healthy functions.
Now, they say that bananas are full of magnesium. My mother, who's great on all sorts of health, eat, Margaret, eat a banana, it'll pick your magnesium levels up. I can see that you're lacking a bit there. Now, how many bananas do you have to eat to bring your magnesium level?
You see, that's a good question, because the problem with bananas is they're also loaded with sugar.
Yeah.
So you might be getting the magnesium from bananas, but your question of how much do you need to get enough magnesium, it's going to spike your insulin so much that the negative effect of spiking your insulin is it sort of almost counteracts the benefit you get from the magnesium you're getting from the bananas.
I'm dying to ask, because I've got 5 grandsons, and I'm the granny who used to bring sweets. I don't anymore.
Good for you, Granny.
And then, but you see them go to a party and you see them consuming these great big cakes full of icing and that. And I just said, that little body is so tiny, and he's had like 2 of these cupcakes with all this icing on top. What is it doing to his insulin levels now? Because I mean, that insulin must be going through the roof.
Yeah. So Margaret, you know what I'm going to suggest, because I've got a lot to talk about on gut. Can we hold that question to next week?
Next week,
because that question specifically I'm going to address next week, because it's a great question.
Yeah. Okay. Carry on. So now we're in our gut, and
all right.
Wait, sorry, I want to ask a question quickly. When you're talking about magnesium, which is the best magnesium supplement to take?
All right, so it really depends on what the problem is. So, for example, the goodies, the 2 ones that I like are magnesium citrate and magnesium glycinate. But both of those are quite expensive. So it depends on, for example, because magnesium can actually loosen the gut a little bit, and it gives you a runny tummy. So people, for example, if they're very sensitive to magnesium, let's say, for example, they start with magnesium citrate, and they get a runny tummy, they might do better on magnesium glycinate. I like magnesium glycinate because it's got a little bit of glycine in it. And glycine, and this is a whole nother subject, our food is sprayed with glyphosate, as much as we don't want it to, but it is. And the problem with glyphosate is it's a distorted form of glycine. It actually takes up the receptor site, the glycine receptor site. Glycine is an amino acid. It takes up the glycine receptor site. So what we want, so what I like about magnesium glycinate, it gives you a little bit of glycine to sit on that receptor site. So hopefully occupy the receptor site, so the glyphosate that we're exposed to, in actual fact, there's already something squatting on the receptor site. So that's why I like magnesium glycinate. The other thing I will say, though, is magnesium is an expensive supplement. So for those people who you go into Dis-Chem and you take a look at the price and you say, no, thank you very much, I can't afford this. Epsom salts is magnesium sulfate, and 1/4 teaspoon of Epsom salts every single day. It tastes terrible because it's really bitter, but you have it in a half a glass of water, mix it up, very bitter, and just chase it with clean water. The water tastes like it's got sugar in it because it's so sweet compared with the bitter Epsom salts. But women, especially if they're a bit constipated, Epsom salts helps to clean out the gut, but it just gives your body a little bit of magnesium. So those would be the 2 extremes.
Thanks, Jules.
The other thing I just wanted to add, Jules, about the supplements, and do you need supplements regardless of your diet, and what supplements do you take? I just wanted to mention that I've been on a personal journey with Jules and my health and all that sort of stuff. And as a suggestion of hers, which I think is fantastic, you take your car for a yearly service and you see what's wrong and you fix what's wrong. And Jules has a set of like baseline tests, very affordable to do annually. She even suggests if you can't afford it, do half 1 year, half the other year. And you just do a baseline test of your vitamin D, your, those necessary things for optimal bodily function. And then those are the stuff, now okay, this is what I need to take, this is what I need to do. And it just makes it so clear, and you feel so much better. It's amazing what adding a supplement to your life can actually do to your energy levels, your thinking patterns. And it's something you wouldn't think of if you don't start this journey, because it seems too simple, but it really does work. So that's a great way to go about it, is to service your body and see what's
just thanks for that, because in actual fact, there's some blood tests which are almost hardly ever done, that are almost like blanket blood tests. I can look at those blood tests, and they're about 5. I can look at those, and if you address the imbalances just on those, so HbA1c, for example, that looks at your sugars, if you address your sugars, for example, so I can see with an HbA1c, I can see whether or not your body's metabolizing sugar. If your body's not metabolizing sugar, you can actually put the patient onto a targeted health approach that just addresses that. Now, the blanket benefit is going to affect your risk of Alzheimer's. It's going to affect your weight issues, your obesity, and of course, it affects your risk of developing prediabetes or insulin resistance or diabetes. And just that one almost alone has such a benefit on your longevity and your, I would say, your health span versus your lifespan. And that's one test. And it's not routinely done. And the doctors will do it if they think you have a problem, but they don't do it routinely. So if you start even in your 30s and you test, I would say, you know, almost if you test one thing, do that one, you can resolve so much from a long-term perspective. Okay, so let's go on to the gut.
Quickly before you go, yeah. I'm somebody who doesn't drink water. I actually don't drink water.
Margaret, no.
So I'm 71 and I'm reasonably healthy. Actually, I'm very healthy, touch wood. But how important is water? You know, I just think it flushes your system out. It flushes all the good stuff out with the bad stuff. How important is it to drink water? And is it necessary to drink 8 glasses a day? I've never, ever drunk 8 glasses a day in my life.
Margaret, water's beyond important. It's so important to clean out the toxins. You know, so look, when they say 8 glasses, it's really related to what your weight is. So anything between 6 and 8 glasses, because what water helps to do is that when it's flushing your kidneys, it helps, because if your kidneys are sluggish, the load of detox is on your liver, and our liver is so important for a gazillion other reasons. Yeah. So yes, I really, really think water is important. And it's, people will often say to me, well, but you know, I drink fluids, you know, so I drink tea and all that, but the body perceives tea, you know, so I'm not talking about like the herbal teas. So if you want to drink rooibos tea instead of water, that's, you know, that's effectively a water. But you need, so for example, if they think, okay, I'm drinking coffee and tea with milk and all that, the body perceives those almost as foods. And more than so your body's dealing with the toxins that come in with coffee, and the load on the body is greater than the flush out from the water. So drinking clean water is really, really important.
Sorry, Judy, can I just quickly come in? But there's water and there's water, because the water that we drink that is in bottle form, that's had a lot of the minerals taken out. I mean, the water that we should be drinking is actually water that comes directly from a mountain stream. And how many people drink that? So I think, you know, Margaret's got a really good point. What sort of water should we be drinking? Because it's got to have minerals in it. It's got to have the natural minerals from the earth in it to make it worthwhile.
They say the water has been through 5 people before it gets to you.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Look, the thing is, it doesn't have to have the minerals in if you are eating a good diet, because you'll get your minerals from your diet. So, but if you're drinking bottled water, you're getting the BPS from that as well. So you are getting a degree of toxins, but the water in South Africa is processed fairly cleanly. But to drink purified water, in other words, even if you get one of those clay water purifiers and you run your water through that, that is obviously first prize. But even if you don't, even if you're drinking directly from the tap, you still need to have water. You still need to flush out your kidneys. I'm going to go on to, because what's happening, we're digressing, and I need to stay on the gut. Otherwise, we're going to run out of time because it's already 20 to 10, and I've still got lots to say. So let me go now onto the gut specifically. So when you're looking at assaults on the gut, gluten and food sensitivities. Gluten is very damaging to the gut. So basically what gluten does, so gluten comes in any wheat. So gluten is the gliadin in the wheat is a protein. And what the gliadin does, because, you know, people now are not sure whether or not gluten is just faddy. You know, is it faddy to go on a gluten-free diet? So the question is, how bad is gluten? Now, the gluten sensitivities, they're now looking at gluten sensitivities as opposed to gluten allergy. So if you have a gluten allergy, you're a celiac. That is much more extreme. But gluten sensitivities, the estimate now is between 50 and 60% of the population have gluten sensitivity. And it's a sensitivity to, it's either the protein gliadin or it's the glyphosate that they spray on our wheat. So we can't really at this point distinguish between whether it's the glyphosate or whether it's the gliadin, but the effect in the body is the same. And it presents with quite a wide range of symptoms. So the problem would be very often the bloating, reflux that causes reflux. But the biggest issue is gluten stimulates in our cells the secretion of something, it's a protein called zonulin. Now, what zonulin does is that normally in our gut, the lining of our gut is actually very thin. It's only got one layer of cells, and it's covered by a nice big fat mucus layer. So what happens with gluten is gluten works like a pot scourer. It actually scrubs off that mucus layer that protects that very fine 1 cell deep layer between our gut, and our gut is the front line. It's almost like the gateway from what comes into our body with what comes in through our mouth into what goes into our cells. So you want that layer of cells to be protected, and gluten stimulates zonulin, and zonulin opens those gut junctions. Now, if the gut junctions that should be really closed, they should be tight so that the nutrients can, it's almost like an osmotic pull, they can seep across that gut lining. If zonulin opens them up, what you get is you get partially digested food seeping across into the bloodstream, and you get gut bugs that should stay in the gut seeping into the bloodstream. And the thing is, what happens with our guts, with that seepage, is that in the bloodstream, you've got your immune function. Now, if it's not supposed to be there, your immune function takes one look at this and thinks, what on earth is that? And it's going to increase your immune reactivity. And we don't want our immune reactivity to be on high alert, because we have a system in our body that they call the surveillance system. And really, it's almost like Starship Enterprise. You've got these spaceships that are cruising space. And when they see, for example, a little pocket of undifferentiated cells, and undifferentiated cells are basically a small pocket of cancer cells, our surveillance system, so our immune system, is going to think, what is that? And it's going to zap that. If our immune system is constantly on high alert dealing with food sensitivities, for example, it's not in the surveillance system dealing with those little pockets of cells, it's busy somewhere else. So we want to make sure that we free up our immune system to deal with those sort of issues. So what an increase in zonulin does, it increases our intestinal permeability. So we call that leaky gut. So foodstuffs and gut bugs leak across, and you can measure that. We don't need to measure that. You just want to make sure that your gut bugs are nice and tight and closed. So when you're looking at supporting the gut, I actually just think I'm just going to go pop back to the assaults on the gut. Medications, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. So if you've got any of the arthritic conditions and you're on non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, they trash the gut. And when the gut is trashed, it increases your inflammation, and inflammation increases your pain. So you get it's its own vicious cycle when you're dealing with that. Corticosteroids and antibiotics, we all know antibiotics trash the gut. Parasites, so any kind of parasite that causes inflammation and toxins in the gut, that affects the integrity of gut. Excessive stress, which we've sort of addressed, that affects the integrity of gut. Alcohol and nicotine both trash the gut. Any cancer radiation therapy, that's going to break down your gut. Nutrient insufficiency. So we're back to dealing with problems with the body's basic functioning if you don't have a diet that has sufficient nutrients. And, which we'll address next week, excessive simple sugar consumption. And that causes an inflammation in itself. But the other thing that excessive sugar consumption does causes inflammation. So I just said that twice, didn't I? So the sugar consumption, it feeds gut bugs that are inflammatory gut bugs. So we've got in our gut pro-inflammatory gut bugs and anti-inflammatory gut bugs. You obviously want more of the anti-inflammatory gut bugs because you want to cool your body, because all our non-communicable diseases, the foundation of our non-communicable diseases is inflammation. So cancer, foundation inflammation, heart attack, foundation inflammation, stroke, inflammation. So keeping the body cool of inflammatory processes is almost, and it's a cornerstone actually of health. So let's look at when we're supporting the gut, probiotics. Now, I want to say with probiotics, I am not pro just going on to probiotics. I used to be, but I've been researching that intensively. Now, the problem with probiotics is that in our gut, we need a very wide species range. Now, in the old days, we had something along the lines of 40,000 different species of nematodes and little worms and gut bugs and all of that in our gut. And the body loves that. The body loves that whole wide variety. Now, because of what we're exposed to, the toxins, the diet, zonulin, all of these sort of things, the species that remain in our gut, antibiotics, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, corticosteroids, that species is now down to about 2,000. That's not conducive to good health. So what happens is that we believe that going on to a probiotic is a really good thing. And if you're really sick and you've got big problems with your gut, but this really does need to be assessed by a professional. If you're really sick, you need to start turning that around, and then probiotics are a good thing. But if you're on probiotics routinely and you go along and you look at Dischem and you look at the whole range of probiotics and you think, oh, I'll go on this one. It might have, let's say, 8. So, and you know, there's one that you can say 8 strain. And now you're on 8 strain all the time. Then what happens is that you get a predisposition or propensity for that 8 strain in your gut. And that's as problematic because, again, what you're doing is you're cutting down the variety into 8 strain. So now 8 strain, you've got this preponderance of the 8 strain gut bugs instead of the variety. So people who very often are the healthiest are the ones who are out there digging in the soils. They are growing their own gardens because they're breathing in and they're working with their hands. And babies, you know, we keep our children away from good bacteria. So, okay, so mothers, I know you're gonna have a fit. But babies who eat in every now and again a dog poo and, you know, and they're eating soil and they chomp a few earthworms and all of these little things that babies tend to do or little people tend to do, it increases that variety and increases, and that from a health perspective is very good. Obviously, again, if the dog poo has got parasites in it, that's obviously going to cause a problem. But when you're looking now they're looking at fecal transplants. So for example, let's say you're in hospital, you're very sick in hospital. There's a superbug that goes around the hospitals called C. difficile. And C. difficile is a killer. So people who, if they are unwell and they are infected with C. diff, their chance of surviving is not good. And now they've worked out that the way to address C. diff is not to give antibiotics, which is what they used to do in the past. They do a fecal transplant. They give the poo from somebody else who's got a healthy gut. They transplant that into the gut. Luckily, you don't have to take it orally. They'll do it. You'll go in and you'll have a sort of a good old procedure, and they'll transplant that into your gut, and it will within 24 hours turn around health from being life-threatening to being life-supporting. So that's just an overview of the importance of really, a good healthy gut bugs. Prebiotics, and this is where, for example, people who have a diet that's high in vegetables is very healthy because vegetables are high in the fibers that gut bugs like to eat. So prebiotics are usually fibers that gut bugs feed on. You need to address your diet because, for example, what our gut bugs do is our gut bugs release our vitamin B, and our vitamin B is what helps not only does it help our energy levels, but it helps our body make our neurotransmitters. So we feel better when our body is producing enough of the vitamin Bs. If you have poor gut bugs, your body's not producing the vitamin Bs. Your body's not synthesizing them, and gut bugs are not releasing them. So addressing your diet and improving your gut bug profile is really, really important. So there's certain supplements, and now we're back to whether some supplements are important and some are not. So vitamin D is very important. Vitamin D is fantastic for gut bug and body health. zinc and omega-3 are just 3 very, very good vitamins that help to support the gut. And obviously to, you know, really think twice. You know, if you've got a little bit of an infected toenail, please don't go on antibiotics. The impact from your body, the impact on your body from those antibiotics is so profound. And, you know, the thing is that it's almost like a go-to if you've got children. Some children have been on antibiotics, never mind 3 times in their little lives, it's 3 times a year. And the damage on the gut bugs is really quite profound. So I just think
there's a question with regards to kombucha and if it's the same in terms of limiting strains.
Great question. Kombucha and kefir are actually lovely because I like those better than just going on the 8 strains. So going on, it's cheap, it's wonderful to make because it's very, very cheap. And the other thing is with kombucha, and Margaret, maybe you should do this. You get kombucha and then you create the kombucha in the tea room, and people can have a little bit of kombucha and then, you know, go and at their tea break, they just have a little bit of kombucha, because the other thing, the SCOBY that makes kombucha, it makes babies. Yeah. So it's incredibly cheap. And you can just, those babies can then, as it makes babies, they can just go to people's homes. And so instead of buying them, they can make them. And really, to make kombucha, you need 5 tablespoons of sugar and you need tea. You don't even need the tea. Water's fine. Just tea just gives it a little bit of flavor. The only problem with kombucha is that it's extremely high in histamine. So certain people don't deal with histamine well. And kombucha is very high. So kefir not as bad. Kefir is like a milk.
To get my team to drink kombucha would be impossible. Glenda and I used to grow it and do our own. I must say mine just got bigger and bigger, and I got a bit nervous.
Yeah, they do, hey?
Over the whole kitchen. But yeah, and Glenda, we must start it again because it really is good for you. But I've such a good idea, and I will do it in my stores, and I'll take pictures of the staff's faces when I show them.
Yes, you've almost got to hide it because they think, I'm not having that.
Yeah.
But really, the problem is it's made with sugar, obviously, because it's got to have the sugar.
Yes, but your SCOBY eats the sugar. So what happens
eats the sugar?
Yes.
But you don't know, sometimes you can actually not leave it long enough, and then you've got all that sugar going in your system.
Yeah, so what you want the fluid that's created to be slightly tart, slightly acidic.
Yeah.
And then the easiest thing to do is, and so what I do with mine is, you know what, I feel very sophisticated. I just put a bit of ice in the bottom of a wine glass, and then I put a little bit on the ice because then it's cold, and then you don't have the acidity. But you're 100% right. You want the SCOBY to have really processed the sugars so that the result is very slightly acidic. And the thing is, if you leave it for too long, then it's too acidic and then it's inedible. So you're normally looking at about 2 weeks. 2 weeks is generally the sort of the perfect time frame.
Jules, you were mentioning having a histamine issue with kombucha, and a lot of the foods for the gut are high in histamine. What would you suggest as a better alternative then?
You mean than
like fermented foods? Yeah, and other fermented foods that are high in histamine.
Yeah, you know what, Stace? I mean, it's really a good question, because so what you actually have to do, you have to address the histamine first. So it's a stacked approach. You leave the gut bugs, you address the histamine first, and then you address the gut bugs. So it's unfortunately not a straightforward answer with that, because if you leave the histamine, your body's inflammatory process is high. So you need to address that histamine issue. So people, for example, if they're high in histamine, they're very allergic. They get nasal problems. They're snuffly all the time. They feel like they've got flu all the time. You know, polyps and runny nose and hives and itchiness. And so, for example, if you have a shower and you're very itchy and scratchy after the shower, the chance of you being high in histamine is very good. You know, so yes, you need to really address that first. There are some gut bugs that don't produce histamine, but unfortunately in South Africa, they don't differentiate between the low histamine producers and the high histamine producers. So we don't have that option in South Africa. We can't really separate probiotics that are high histamine producers and that are not. And unfortunately, kombucha is, it's cheap, but it's, so my advice would be, you try it. You see how you do with it, because the benefits are huge. And then if you find, oh no, you know what, it always makes me feel snuffly, then one needs to address histamine.
Jules, there's one more question with regards to the probiotics. My mum is elderly and on chronic heart medication. She has constant constipation, and I'm at a loss as to how to get a balance of fiber in the diet correctly. Does she need more or less? And how to help with the constipation whilst on chronic meds? Must I get her supplements or probiotics?
Okay, so a probiotic is a very good start, actually, because in actual fact, our feces is made up of, probably the bulk of it is dead gut bugs. You know, so it's not so much what we're eating, although that is a part of it, it's fiber and dead gut bugs. So I would suggest that that's a very good start, is start your mom on a probiotic. What I would suggest though is if there's a big imbalance and you don't know whether there is a big imbalance, I would say probably yes, there is. Don't just give her a whole probiotic. Basically, you start with a capsule, break the capsule open, just with the tip of the knife. Dip the tip of the knife into the little powder that's on the plate, and just your mom can just put it on her tongue. It's got a slightly nutty flavor. They're not horrible at all, not at all. And then you wait to see, you know, you do a tiny little bit for about 2 or 3 days. How is she responding to that? Is she feeling, is it making her feel bad? Is she feeling clogged or anything like that? If all is good, then you start increasing that until it's like a third of the capsule, and then half the capsule, and then the whole capsule. And you start doing that, because that will definitely help the bulking of what she's of what's in her gut. Because the thing is that if you're not digesting properly, and elderly people do not digest properly, then the food is basically going through her gut, and it's, if you increase the fiber, it's making it worse because nothing's moving through. So you also need to increase her digestion. So I would before she eats, maybe put her on 2 digestive enzymes. So literally 5 minutes before she eats, you get digestive enzymes and you give it those. So really the digestive enzymes are going in first. You can just imagine in the bottom of the gut, there they are, our mouths open. And then when the food comes in, because elderly people, their own digestive enzymes are really, really inefficient. I mean, if your mum's over 75, in fact, elderly people generally have poor digestion, then the digestive enzymes will just help to process what's coming in.
Which probiotics would you suggest, Jules?
So generally what I do when I look at price, because probiotics can be quite expensive, I'm not pro that 8-strain one, because if you think about the amount of probiotics in our gut, it's generally 10 times the number of cells in our body. So if we were to count every single cell in our body, let's say it comes to 3 trillion. The number of gut bugs is about 30 trillion. So in actual fact, we're not humans with some gut bugs. We're actually gut bugs with a little skin of humanity on us, because we've got so many more gut bugs. So when you're choosing a good choice, go for the ones in the fridge, and they've got about 25 billion gut bugs per capsule. Go for those ones. You will pay more, but it's worth the price, because your body's really, you know, these 25 million ones, it sounds like a lot, but it's a drop in the ocean. It's really just not good enough. So I will generally put patients onto GastroChoice. GastroChoice to me is like a reasonably priced one. You can get the dark blue box or the light blue box, and you want to keep changing those. So you want to change your gut bugs, but remember, as I say, these are transitional things. It's not something that you're just going to go on forever, because otherwise, again, you get the preponderance of those strains, and that's not ideal at all. So
okay, so now our time is nearly up. We've got literally 1 minute to go. So
okay.
Yeah, Judy, thanks so much. What a lot of information you've got. I mean, I didn't know my body was so complicated. I just thought I ate stuff and it went and it fixed me, or it didn't. Yeah. But yeah, I've been cooking with Azelle, and she cooks anti-inflammatory food. She'll tell you onions are anti-inflammatory, garlic's anti-inflammatory, those type of things.
Yeah.
But I think we've got to start looking for anti-inflammatory foods. I don't like taking supplements. My husband's crazy on supplements, using my supplements every day, and I never take them, and he never gets sick of giving them to me. But yeah, I think I'm really going to take them now. I'm going to look into probiotics as well. I think it seems like that is necessary. And yeah, and we can't wait for next week when you come back with more on sugar, which is a huge, I mean, I can't believe with my stop that diabetes is massive, especially in the Indian community. So I'm really hoping we're going to have a lot of those people. And yeah, we can't wait to get back next week. And girls, send me all your questions. I see we have a lot of guys in this week as well. Send us your questions. Email me, Margaret at Hershey's. You can Facebook me, you can whatever. Send me your questions. I'll send them all through to Jules, and we'll try and answer all your questions again. We've got lots of questions here that we didn't get to. But thank you so much for joining us today. Gut health is your real wealth at the end of the day. So thank you very much. See you next Monday. Thank you, Jules. Thank you, Stacey and Jesse.
Bye, Margaret. Thank you so much, Jules.
I hope you have a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We really start next year on the right foot. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.